So my name is Esther Lightstone. My maiden name is Esther Perlmutter. I was born in Poland, not far from the Russian border, in 1925 in a small town called Rokitna. And I grew up in a fairly nice home with a middle-class family and had quite a nice life as a child. As a child, I had quite a lot of friends, and growing up in Poland in the late 30s was not an easy task. There was quite a bit of anti-Semitism, and quite often Jewish kids got beaten up by the Polish children simply because they were Jewish, especially around Easter when they thought that the Jews had killed Christ, so they would come in our house and beat us up and leave, and we couldn't really do much about it. By the end of '38, anti-Semitism in Poland was flourishing to a point where Jews had been given special taxes, pay more than anybody else. The university had restrictions on entries for Jews, and only a few could get in, and those that got in during lectures had to stand up, and during intermission got beaten up simply because they were Jews. And I used to go and visit my relatives that were about 60 kilometers away from my hometown every summer and spend with my aunt a month and then come back home when school started. In 1939, I went to visit my aunt, and that was just the beginning of September. 3 days later, the war started, and Poland was attacked by Germany, and we were bombed every day. So going back home was rather difficult because the trains stopped functioning. The railroads were bombed, so there was no way I could get home. Then we had to hide every day, since we were bombed every day, several times a day. We had to hide in trenches. Some people got hurt, some people got killed. We decided to leave to a smaller town where it was not on the map, and so we would avoid all the bombing. So my aunt, my uncle, my cousins, and their husband and children got a couple of horses and a buggy, and we left for a small town which was called Mielnica. It was rather a village with few Jews there, and we settled in a home of some friends, and we had to hide in the cellar every day because there was no government anymore, and people took their laws in their own hand. The Germans have been approaching one way, then the Russians have crossed the Polish border, and they had come through my hometown. At that point, I was separated from my family and actually never thought that we would get together. While the Germans were approaching Mielnica, a group of Polish people got together and decided that it was all the Jewish people's fault. They invited the Russians and Germans. They gathered up 100 people, brought them into the forest, and killed them all. And they came into our house. Fortunately, we were hiding in a cellar, and the door to the cellar was on the floor, covered with the carpet, where they didn't realize that we were there, and therefore we were saved. when we got out of hiding the following day, when I heard that the Russians have crossed and they were in my hometown, I was hoping that somehow the Russians will continue and come into the village. I would be able to get back home. However, the Germans came, and then the Russians and the Germans had made a non-aggression pact, and they divided Poland by the River Bug. So the Germans backed up, the Russians came in, and so at that point I knew I would be able to return back home. The trains started to run after a couple of weeks. They had fixed the railroads, and so when my aunt, my uncle and cousins found out that the trains were going, we all went to the train station, and they hopped in on the first train going west, where I had to go east. So I was left on my own. I was 14 years old, living sleeping under the table and eating nothing, scared and wondering how am I ever going to get home. After 3 days at the train station, a train arrived going east, and those trains were not your passenger trains. They were freight trains, and so people were all packed in like cattle, and everybody was standing and just hoping to get to their destination. I saw a Polish soldier that had come back from the front eating some bread. I hadn't eaten in several days, so I was very hungry. So I looked at him and tears started to come down my face. He looked at me, realizing I was Jewish, because most Poles are blonde. He looked and said, "What are you staring at, you dirty Jew?" And he was on a crutch, and I thought he was going to hit me with the crutch. So I ran to the other side of the corner of the car. We finally arrived at a small town called Sarny, which was about a couple hours away from my hometown. The train didn't go any further, so I was off into the train station again, sitting in the corner, very scared, worrying, hammering, how am I going to get home? I saw Russian soldiers standing on guard and guarding the station. He took out a box of crackers and he was eating. I looked at him and tears came down my eyes. And he looked at me with a very kind look and said, "Why are you, little girl, crying?" And I simply said I was hungry. He took the box of crackers and gave it to me, and I shall never forget them, since there is no one that can make you feel good when you're hungry and give you a piece of bread. A few days passed by again. I was sleeping under the table. A friend of my father's, who happened to be going back home as well, noticed me and wondered what I was doing at the train station, so I told him my story. He said he had rented a buggy with a couple of horses. He was going home, and he suggested that I should go with them. There was no room for him, so he got a bicycle and he just followed us with a bicycle. We finally arrived to our hometown. It happened to be a holiday which was called Sukkot, and they drove right through to the synagogue. My father's friend ran into the synagogue, told my father, "Mr. Perlmutter, I brought you your daughter." At that point, my parents never knew where I was, whatever happened to me. And that was the greatest shock and surprise in their life. We went to my home. For the first time, my mother had heard me say I was hungry, since when I was a child I was a poor eater and I'd never want to eat all the good food. So that's when I finally arrived and settled down, and that was in 1939, at the beginning of October. Then the Russians came, and at that point there was, all the stores were closed, there was no groceries. The Russians have taken off all the food and sent it off to the army, so we had to stay in line to get bread, sugar, and whatever else. Luckily, my parents had a big garden, so we had lots of vegetables and some fruit. We also had quite a bit of flour and sugar that we would always store in the storage room. So it wasn't that bad. But the Russians have started collecting all the people they thought that were bourgeoisie and had been capitalists, and lined them up and sent them off to Siberia. So when we got up in the morning, we never knew who were shipped off. Lucky for these people, because would they have stayed on, and the Germans, when the Germans came, they would have been killed. So some of them survived. So from 1939 till 1941, life was almost bearable under the Russian regime, because there was a shortage of food, a shortage of clothes, and everything was sent from Poland to Russia and to the front lines. And since Stalin made a non-aggression pact in 1939 with Hitler, they were rather sure that there would be no war between Russia and Germany. However, in 22nd of June 1941, Hitler had bombed Moscow and Russia, and so the war started all over again. Even though Rokitna was a small little town, village almost, we were bombed constantly. And so finally, in August, a group of people from our hometown, men, got together and decided that perhaps the Germans would spare women and children, but they wouldn't spare men. So some of the men decided they should get together and leave town and leave their families behind. However, when I have experienced already in 1939 the war in Poland at my aunt's place, I persuaded my father that we should all come along. And almost the last minute, we were lucky that we had horses, our own, and a buggy, and these were our means of transportation. We loaded up our horses, our buggy, and took only the essentials. My father was smart enough to put a lot of food for the horses so they would be able to carry us as far as possible. 22 families got together and we left town. Some of them thought they should take all their belongings and took little food for the horses. And so we started our wander, and we were going from village to village, town to town, sleeping in the forest, eating whatever we could get our hands on. At the same time, while we were going as a caravan, the Germans had no trouble lowering their plane and shooting at us. And so some people were killed, some people were wounded. And so by the time we arrived to Kiev in Russia, very few families survived, and some had to stay behind because their horses could not take them along. So out of 22 families, only 3 families managed to survive, and there were our family and 2 other families. And so we lived in the forests, in villages, under the open sky, with hardly any food, trying to go almost at dark so that we wouldn't be spotted by the Germans, and staying in the forest during the day and just going very slowly whenever it was safe. However, when we were running away, everything was on fire, the fields were burning, houses were burning, some of the cows were running, and so we would catch a cow and kill it, and then divide it among the families and cook at the fire some of our meals. And then we arrived to Central Russia. It was just about November, beginning of November. We had gone to a farm to collect the farm, and we offered them our horses for exchange for a ticket to go to the Middle East, which was Uzbekistan, which was Russian Middle East. They gave us tickets, so the 3 families have left, and we went on the train from Moscow train. We weren't allowed into Moscow, but it was just outside of Moscow. We caught the train and we went to Uzbekistan. The train trip lasted almost 3 weeks because A, we were bombed, they had to stop. B, they had to let through the trains that would carry the soldiers, the wounded soldiers. So 3 weeks after, we had arrived in Tashkent. Tashkent is the capital city of Uzbekistan. And there was a big influx of refugees. So everybody sat on their suitcase at the train station, at the platform, and slept there. And there was also a shift kitchen, so we would stand in the line to get a bowl of soup and a bit of bread. We also had to stand in the line to get to the washroom, and sometimes, unfortunately, by the time you made a washroom, you didn't need it anymore. So that was another problem. So we stayed at that place for about 2 weeks. Since my father was an expert in lumber, and he had a lumber yard before the war, he managed to get a job in a small town in Uzbekistan, not terribly far from Tashkent, called Dinau. And he got this job, and we also got a place to live. And the house had 1 room, a kitchen, and sort of a pantry, whatever you call it. And we all stayed in that 1 room, and that room was a bedroom, was a dining room, was a living room. And my brother slept in the kitchen. My father got this job, and that job didn't last long because there was no lumber. So again, he had no employment. We were literally starving. We almost had to go and pick up in the garbage peels from potatoes, carrots, whatever we could find, bring home, wash it, boil it, and eat it. My dad got sick, and he was sick with actually malaria, but then he got better, and then he got gallstones. There was no doctor, so we just had to suffer. And shortly after, I got malaria, which lasted for 6 years, and it was a horrible thing to get because you'd get an attack every month, and it could last for a few days and a few weeks, and I find myself sometimes passed out and being taken to a hospital which had beds that were cots that soldiers would usually sleep. The mattress was made out of straw, and the sheets probably never saw water in a long time. So, however, we made the best, and there was one moment that I probably will never forget, when my father walked down the street and really didn't know what will become of us. He bumped into a Russian general that he actually knew a long time before, and he said to my father, "You look very worried, what is the matter with you?" And so my father explained to him that we were simply starving. Within a few days, there was the main transportation were donkeys and mules. So a donkey arrived with a couple of sacks of rice, sugar, and oil, and what have you. Well, that probably was the greatest day in our life. However, it just didn't last very long. But shortly after, my father did get another job, and we would get regular ration, which was like once a month a kilo of sugar. We hardly saw any butter, oil once a month, and a couple of bars of soap, which was supposed to have lasted for washing ourselves, and that meant going to the river in the morning and washing yourself, to going to public bath, which was costly, and then at least we had the ration of food. However, somebody squealed on my father, whatever they said. The ration KGB came in at night, and they took him away. And so we were left alone, not knowing where he went and whatever happened to him. So shortly after, a couple months, we received a letter with no return address. So we soon figured out that he was in Siberia. So now I was in charge of the household. My mother was totally helpless. My brother was 9 years younger than myself. I had finished high school while working in school as a secretary, also working in a factory, a cotton factory, since Uzbekistan produced a lot of cotton. They would use the seeds to make oil. So once the seeds were cleared of the cotton, they were sent on transformers to the oil factory. And so I worked in an empty field at a transformer where it would fill up 50 kilo of oil seeds, the seeds from the cotton seeds for oil, and open the box and send it off from the cotton on a transformer to the oil factory. I used to work on shifts, and so quite often my shift would be from 11 at night to 6 in the morning. Then I would come home and sleep for a couple hours and go to school from 1 to 5 or 6. That's how I got my high school degree. One night, I had worked with several people on different shifts. One of the women that was supposed to have worked on that, my shift. Actually, I was supposed to work at night from 11 to 6, but I had an attack of malaria. So the woman that was supposed to take over my shift came in and took my shift from 11 till 6. And at that point, a group of thieves were breaking into the cotton factory, simply stealing cotton. Since she was on the way, they killed her. That could have been me. So I think that God has looked after me from day one. After I decided to go to university and study medicine, after a couple of months, I found out, which I had to go to another town, since there was no university in the place we lived, I found out that my mother was bitten by a dog and she was almost close to getting gangrene. My brother was only, about 10 years old, was starving, and when I came home and I realized what was going on, I quit school, went to the market, and if you sold something at the market, you were able to buy. There was always a black market where you could buy things, but you needed a lot of money. A kilo bread was 60 ruble. My salary was 400 ruble. So you can figure out how many kilo bread I got for a month. Grapes and other fruits were cheap, but bread, potatoes, and all the staples were extremely expensive. Again, I found myself at odds, not knowing what to do, couldn't continue my education, had to take charge of my whole family, and I was 17. So, since I spoke Russian and Polish and Yiddish, I was walking down the street into a man who was from my hometown, and he recognized me. He lived in a town nearby, and I told him what has happened. He had been involved with a lady who was the principal of an orphanage. She looked after an orphanage that already has been sponsored by UNRWA. And the kids in the orphanage were Russians, Polish, Jewish, Uzbeks, Tatars from all over. And these were kids whose father was killed in the army and the mother disappeared. So some were orphans and some still would have a mother, but they were allowed to stay in the orphanage. This friend of mine persuaded this principal to try me out and see if I would work out as a teacher and looking after the kids as well. And that saved me. I got the job. I didn't know about teaching from beans. And I came in, most people that were working there had been teachers and much older than me. I was the youngest, and being 17, 18, I looked like 15. So I was worried if those kids are going to actually have any respect for me. I was given to work with kids from age 5 to 7, and they were the loveliest children to work with. There was a lady that worked with me. She was from Poland, and she was a professional teacher, so she taught me the trade of the teaching, and it didn't take long, and I became a teacher, getting a small salary, but since the children would get food 3 times a day, we were allowed to get the same food, as well as once a month they would get clothing and other supplies. We were allowed to get that. And so I brought my mother and my brother to that town. We found a place which was, I wouldn't compare it to the house I live now, because it was a stable converted, a horse stable converted into living quarters. It was basically a very large room with a thatched roof made of clay with small windows about 20 inches. And of course there were no running water or light, and our stove was made of clay with several rims that are supposed to give you the high heat and low heat. And it didn't really much matter because there was no food to cook. And our main soup would be a couple tablespoons of flour, a fried onion and oil and water. And so this was our soup. Bread, we would go and get, I would go and stay in a line, get my portion, my mother's portion, and I would start nibbling on my portions. And by the time I arrived home, I have eaten a quarter of my bread. When I came, I burst into tears, feeling hungry and feeling sad that I've eaten most of my portion just for breakfast. Of course, we had no clothes. I had no shoes. So I wore my father's boots. During the winter, when it rained, there were no sidewalks or cement sidewalks, or it was mud. So you walked in the mud, and one day I remember coming home from school wearing my father's boots, which were much bigger than my foot. So obviously they got stuck in the mud and I just couldn't pull them out. I took the boots and pulled them out with my hands and walked home bare feet. I arrived home crying, and my mother looked at me and of course broke her heart, and I said, when the war is over, I will never go bare feet again. I'll have as many shoes as I could possibly have. Today I have 25 pairs. And so this sort of situation lasted. Of course, me being sick, I was at least lucky to get the days off whenever I had an attack. And there wasn't much you could do. I also had dysentery, and I also got pneumonia. And so when you get an attack of malaria and get pneumonia, you don't know whether the fever comes from pneumonia or from malaria. And so my mother did find a doctor, 1 in 6 years. When he came and looked at me, he said, there's no medicine, there's nothing I can give you. If she's strong, she'll survive. If not, she'll die. And of course, an awful lot of people from Europe who arrived in Uzbekistan had died from malaria. In any event, the director that had hired me finally resigned. She left for no reason. I don't know. She left. They appointed another principal, and this guy was a Polish man who had a wife and a couple children. And since I was the youngest in that orphanage, he thought it wouldn't be a bad idea if I go to the steam bath with him. And so one day he called me in. He said, he put out on the table stuff I have never seen since the war started, even chocolate and sugar and oil. And he suggested that I can have it all if I go to the steam bath with him. Of course, I wouldn't go to the steam bath with him today when I'm over 80, or let alone when I'm 18. So I told him I would think about it and let him know, knowing that he had the power to do whatever he wanted. I came and told the story to my mother, and we decided that we would starve. In that school was a teacher who was in his 30s, and he was much older than me. And he sort of adopted me, which I thought that he was my older brother, and he was very kind to me and come and stay and talk to us, and we were very, very good friends. Now he was teaching boys that were 14 and a bit younger, and some of them are pretty tough kids. So when I told them the story, of course I wouldn't go to bed with this awful guy. A couple weeks later, I was fired. I lost my job. At that point, I thought that we would starve, except for my brother, that they accepted him in that orphanage. So I told my mother, I'll do anything, any work I can find, we'll survive, not to worry. And during the war, in Uzbekistan, everybody had to go out for a couple hours on Sundays to pick cotton. Nobody got paid for it, it was voluntary, but it wasn't really voluntary, you simply had to go. So we would even take the children that were 10 years old and older for a couple of hours in the fields. So this friend of mine, whose name was Morris, had figured out a way to get rid of that principle. Now in Russia you weren't allowed to hit a kid, because if you did, you went to jail. So he came to the field with his boys, suggested to one of the boys that when he saw the principal coming, you should sit down and do nothing, just rest. And when he came up and asked him, you so-and-so, what are you doing? You're supposed to be working. This kid said, I'm tired, so I decided to take a rest. Behind the bushes was another kid that was going to watch to see what was going to happen. In the meantime, he had a glove, and he took a glove and hit the boy in his cheek, in his face. The other kid got out of there and said, I saw what you did. And the following week, those two kids went to the police with their teacher, Mr. Morris, and told them the story. Within a couple of weeks later, this principal lost his job, and I got mine back. That's 1945, when the war ended. We had already gotten letters from my father telling us he was on the front line. He had then volunteered to go to the front and die faster than dying in Siberia at the slow death. So towards the end of the war, he was in the Russian army, and they were already in Poland, marching towards Germany, and he was one of the army that had walked into Berlin and saw the Russian flag being hoisted up at the Reichstag. So we kept on getting letters. However, my dad did not arrive back to Uzbekistan until 1946. That he was, at that point, Stalin had decided that anyone who was living in Poland before 1939 can return back, knowing that the Iron Curtain would fall over Poland anyway. So we were given trains. They were freight trains taking us back to Poland. And my father had just made it by 5-6 days before we were to leave. So finally we left on the train back to Poland, traveling for months on end. Again, with hardly any food, 24 people in one freight car, two berths, so like 6 people down, 6 people up on 2 sides. And as luck would have it, and we arrived in Poland, somebody had put some chemical and they broke in to our car. And they took one of our most valuable suitcases, stuff my father had bought in Germany, which were gold coins, there were pearls, there were all kinds of stuff that he had bought for next to nothing. So again, we arrived to Poland in 1946. We were placed in the DP camps. And so again, we were 24 people in one room with no facilities and very little food. We spent about 2 months there, and my father had managed to get some work. We had gotten out of that awful place. We found a place in an apartment building, and there was a room and a kitchen again. Part of that building was bombed, so 2 rooms behind our living room had already the roof caved in and some of the bricks in it. But at least we had the running water and we had toilets. So we were able to live more or less a civilized life. Now, I had finished Russian high school, so I had to get Polish credit in order to go to university. The sciences had been recognized, so I had to study again Polish literature and history. So I got my Polish certificate, high school certificate, and I went to university where I studied commerce. I had met a very nice boy, and I fell in love, and we had a lovely time from 1946 to 48. My mother had a sister in Toronto who had found us through Red Cross, and so she contacted us, and she had sent us some papers. And so by October 1948, we had left Poland on a Polish boat, Batory, arrived to New York a couple of weeks later, and from New York to Toronto. And so the end of October 1948, we arrived to Toronto. When we came to Poland, we found out that all our relatives were killed. My mother's sister, my sisters, her children. The Germans have taken her grandchild, my mother's sister's grandchild, from the mother. And when she refused to give it to the German, they took that child and threw against the wall and killed it in the front of all the people they gathered to send to Auschwitz. And so when we came back, we found out that only one of my cousins had survived, which is that aunt's daughter, and she ended up actually going to Moscow, and in the end she left for Australia. And another cousin had survived. That was my father's nephew, my father's sister's son. He had, their house survived, and so in 1946, he went back home, he knocked on the door, he looked at his mother's house, he walked in, and a Polish man answered the door, let him in, and he came to tell him that this was his parents' house. He didn't come here to claim the house, he just came to see it. And he noticed that there were his mother's candlesticks. So he asked the Polish guy if he could have his mother's candlesticks. And he said, of course, not a problem. The guy went to the kitchen, came out with a revolver and killed them. And this was already Poland, 1946. In 1946, when we arrived to Poland, we lived in the city of Breslau. A couple months later, there was a pogrom in a city called Kielce. That was after the war, and after the tragedy, they killed 100 Jews. We realized this was not a safe place to live. So you see, Poland, being anti-Semitic, never stopped being anti-Semitic.